This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show looking at the controversy over the U.S. ban on openly gay men and lesbians serving in the military. On Tuesday, the Pentagon's top leaders voiced support for the first time for an end to Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the military policy that bars gay men and lesbians from serving openly in the military. The comments from Defense Secretary Robert Gates and Admiral Mike Mullen, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, came less than a week after President Obama called for the policy to be repealed during a State of the Union address. Tuesday, Admiral Mike Mullen, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee. Defense Secretary Robert Gates also backed repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, but said the Pentagon needs a year to review the policy change. It remains unclear whether President Obama has enough votes in Congress to push the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell through Congress. On Tuesday, Senator John McCain, the ranking Republican on the Armed Services Committee, expressed his opposition to the policy change. To talk more about Don't Ask, Don't Tell, I'm joined by two guests. Alexander Nicholson is a former U.S. Army human intelligence collector who was discharged in 2002 under the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. He's the founder and executive director of Servicemembers United, a national organization of gay and lesbian troops and veterans and their allies. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Here in New York, Nathaniel Frank, senior research fellow at the University of California, Santa Barbara's Palm Center, and author of the book Unfriendly Fire: How the Gay Ban Undermines the Military and Weakens America. Why don't we begin with Alexander Nicholson, a former U.S. Army human intelligence collector. You were discharged in 2002. Tell us where you worked, what you did, and how exactly you were, well, fired.
Sure. Well, I was, as you mentioned, a human intelligence collector, more colloquially known as an interrogator. I was stationed at a tiny little intelligence base out in the middle of the desert in Arizona called Fort Huachuca. And in the period immediately after 9/11, obviously we were doing a lot of things. I think the Army and all of the intelligence fields were scrambling to figure out its mission and how it was going to accomplish that mission in a new era in the post 9/11 world. So it was very hectic, it was very chaotic, and it was very stressful. And I was basically outed within my unit by a colleague who happened to know that I was gay. A couple of people after a year in the Army had found out that I was gay through various means. And one of my colleagues happened to let that information get out and spread within the unit. And the command was essentially backed into a corner from which it was forced to discharge me because that information had leaked out.
Where were you working?
I was working on Fort Huachuca at the U.S. Army Intelligence Center and schools.
I want to go to Mike Mullen for a minute, testifying yesterday, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was quite astounding what he had to say.
Mr. Chairman, speaking for myself and myself only, it is my personal belief that allowing gays and lesbians to serve openly would be the right thing to do. No matter how I look at this issue, I cannot escape being troubled by the fact that we have in place a policy which forces young men and women to lie about who they are in order to defend their fellow citizens. For me, personally, it comes down to integrity. Theirs as individuals and ours as an institution.
That was Mike Mullen, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We're going to go right now to Secretary Gates. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates also testified over the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
The question before us is not whether the military prepares to make this change, but how we best prepare for it. We have received our orders from the Commander-in-Chief, and we are moving out accordingly. However, we can also take this process only so far, as the ultimate decision rests with you, the Congress.
That was the Secretary of Defense, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Nathaniel Frank, you've been looking at this issue for a long time. You wrote the book Unfriendly Fire. Talk about what Mike Mullen's words meant, how unusual and significant they were.
Well, a lot of us had been waiting for quite a while to hear him speak directly on this issue. and issue his opinion, because in 1993 and subsequent to that, General Colin Powell, who was the chair at the time that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was formulated, helped kind of provide a wall of resistance to President Clinton's effort to lift the ban that existed then. And he was one of a very few number of very powerful people who ensured that Clinton failed. When Admiral Mullen said what he said, it was quite astonishing how powerfully he came out and said, although he did say it was his personal opinion, and he also balanced it with the point that he didn't know exactly what would happen if we lifted the ban, but he said very clearly, in no uncertain terms, not only that he personally believed it was right, but that he had full confidence that our troops could carry out this transition, which is what I'm fully confident about, too.
Did you ever think you would hear the two heads of the military, head of the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Secretary Gates, who also served under George W. Bush, say what they did yesterday?
I have to tell you, I was very worried about what we would hear. I had some confidence from what I had been hearing that these two men didn't have fierce personal opposition to lifting the ban, and not just personal in terms of moral values about equality, but that they understood, as many of us who have studied this for a while understand, that all the research suggests that this is something that can be done rather cleanly, and this is the way these announcements that are very unequivocal are very important, although there is some concern still about the timetable, because that delay could cause problems.
I want to go back to 1993. You mentioned Bill Clinton. This is a short clip of then President Clinton defending Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
An open statement by a service member that he or she is a homosexual will create a rebuttable presumption that he or she intends to engage in prohibited conduct. But the service member will be given an opportunity to refute that presumption. In other words, to demonstrate that he or she intends to live by the rules of conduct that apply in the military service.
Nathaniel Frank, talk about his position in 1993.
Well, President Clinton, in my book, he doesn't come out as the villain. Colin Powell and Sam Nunn were really the wall of resistance. President Clinton did want to lift the ban. He did try to lift the ban, and he spent a considerable amount of political capital on it. But as was his tendency, he also was triangulating. He was waffling and wavering at a certain point. He was trying to please all parties, and he seemed to believe, as many Democrats did at the time, that in order to win over the military, you sort of had to get down on your knee and plead for their respect, rather than earning it by showing that you could command the military as commander-in-chief, which is why it was heartening to hear Secretary Gates this week say, we have received our orders from the commander-in-chief. And I think it's important that President Obama seemed to have gotten his ducks in a row. Consulted them, but also, discussed it in a way that would make clear that these were his orders. And if Clinton had come to this issue armed with the confidence that he really was the commander-in-chief, that he had that authority, and that he had reason and research on his side, I think he could have gone further.
I wanted to go to an angry John McCain, senator of Arizona, who was fiercely taking on the military leaders yesterday.
Has this policy been ideal? No, it is not, but it has been effective. It has helped to balance a potentially disruptive tension between the desires of a minority and the broader interests of our all-volunteer force. It is well understood and predominantly supported by our fighting men and women. It reflects, as I understand them, the preferences of our uniformed services. It has sustained unit cohesion and unit morale, while still allowing gay and lesbian Americans to serve their country in uniform.
That was Senator McCain yesterday, the ranking Republican in the Senate Armed Services Committee. But let's go back to 2006. He was on Chris Matthews' show on MSNBC when Matthews was